on YouTube.
JJ McCullough is a cartoonist, writer, journalist, YouTuber, and a guy who talks about countries, culture, and Canada. He created his YouTube channel way back in 2006, and some 300 videos later, JJ has built an audience of over 370,000 subscribers with over 70 million video views. With his passionate commentary, which encompasses a wide range of topics, from flags to anthems, world leaders to The Simpsons, recycling, politics, propaganda, and of course a healthy selection of content about Canada, the country that he and I call home. His videos are driven by a mantra of living life with the right mix of skepticism and gratitude and not taking things too seriously. So, friends, let's bring the left and right together to make a clapping sound, and welcome to the podcast, JJ McCullough.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. What a flattering introduction.
Yeah, we take those introductions very seriously.
Yes.
So, okay, Chad mentioned you started your channel in 2006, and I know we always like to account for the missing years because you started your first video, and I always like looking at the first video of a channel because it tells a lot about that person. Your very first video was a reaction video to Five Nights at Freddy's, and I thought this is such a time capsule because not only has nothing to do with what you're doing now, but it's Five Nights at Freddy's.
Yes. No, I've come a long way. So yeah, I didn't have a channel in 2006. I mean, I created a YouTube account at that time in order to watch videos or comment.
Right.
I experimented with uploading some sort of silly things, but I started making my channel in 2015. And sort of the genesis of it, that Five Nights at Freddy's video was like strictly a kind of experiment. Like, I did not think I was going to be a reaction shock horror video game guy. I just wanted to do something as my test video, and actually the young woman who was in that video with me, my friend Angela, she knew how to use Premiere, and I wanted to sort of learn from her, so I was like, hey, why don't you teach me through us making a video together? And it's like, well, what can we make a video about? And it's like, oh, Five Nights at Freddy's, that's a hot thing. Let's do some reactions together, and then you can show me how editing works and that on and so forth. And so that was kind of the reason why my first video is such a bizarre, so discordant with what I would later go on to produce, which, as you sort of said, is mostly stuff relating to the different countries of the world and sort of somewhat political topics and so on. But,
were there any YouTubers who were doing what you wanted to do at that time? Was there anybody who was influencing you?
Not so much. So I suppose I should sort of I'll tell you sort of like the genesis of the channel. So it's like, as I get older, I sort of become more aware of the degree to which my sort of career has been built on the back of a lot of sort of increasingly dead or dying media. So like way back in the day, I started out as a blogger. Remember when bloggers were a thing? So like I was like,
I remember that. No.
This was a thing where people used to type on the internet, and we had like websites that weren't moving, and yeah, it was a very archaic sort of form of media. But I was a blogger, and so I wrote sort of my political hot takes and this sort of thing. And I did cartoons. You mentioned that I was a cartoonist. That was sort of something that I was big into. I used to think I was going to be an editorial cartoonist. That was going to be my profession. That's an art form to bet on that has a clear future. So I had a blog, and then sort of through my blog, it became sort of successful. And then I got hired by the Huffington Post Canada, and I worked for them for a while, and I wrote sort of political hot takes there. And then through my success at HuffPo Canada, I got picked up to work on television. And so I was one of these TV pundits that are sort of much maligned today. But that was at one time, that was my sign that I'd really sort of made it. I was a guy on television. I would do these sort of political panels, and they'd be like, oh, JJ, the Prime Minister's poll numbers are going down. What does this mean for his re-election chances? Well, Todd, one of those types. And that was fun. Like I said, that was, to young JJ, who sort of had aspirations of being a kind of opinion journalist, that really sort of made me feel like I had really made it, that I was on television. I worked for CTV here in Canada. I did a lot of what we call hits in the business for a whole bunch of different networks. I was on the radio all the time. And then I kind of got a sort of semi-permanent position working for Sun News, which was this sort of conservative kind of Fox News-esque sort of network that we had up here. And it did not last. That network is, any Canadians listening will know that this was sort of one of the great infamous flops in Canadian television journalism. So after working there just for a couple of years, the network just one day went dark overnight. Like literally, we got an email at like 3 a.m. from the management. It's like, the network's not working out. Make sure you take all your stuff out of the office by noon tomorrow because we're changing the locks. So it was just like, one day you had this kind of career where you're on television every day doing political commentary. The next day you're suddenly out of work and just kind of feeling with your hat in your hand, so to speak. And so I was used to being on television. I was used to sort of blabbing to the world. I was, had grown vain and entitled in the way that TV people often are. And I was like, the world needs to hear more JJ. And even though I've sort of lost my dominant medium, I'm going to find a new one. And then I sort of said, this YouTube thing, the kids seem to be into that. I bet I could be a YouTuber. So I went to the old Best Buy and I, bought a handheld sort of camcorder and a crude little tripod. And like I said, I made that Five Nights at Freddy's video to test it out and to learn how to do editing. And then I just tried doing a bunch of different videos on a bunch of different topics until I kind of got my groove. And I've been doing that for about 6 years, I think it's getting to now. Because I started in 2015 and I've been doing it almost every single week for the last, I guess getting close to 6 years. You
also have a weekly column for the Washington Post. Does that influence what you're going to be talking about on your videos, or are those two completely separate things?
Yeah, they are. I think they are broadly separate. And I suppose this is a sort of point I should emphasize as well when I'm telling my origin story, is that even though I have a background in like political commentary, and that's sort of what I was trained to do, and that's sort of been my dominant profession for most of my adult life, I decided very early on that I did not want to be a political commentator YouTube guy. And so I still have very strong feelings about politics, and I like to articulate them. But I'm lucky enough that I got hired to work at the Washington Post some years ago, and I write a weekly column about Canadian politics. I work for what's called the Global Opinions section. So the way I describe it is I write about Canadian politics for an international audience. So I sort of have, takes on what's going on in the Canadian scene, but I try to write it in a way that's sort of more broadly accessible. But the point is that having that outlet, I can sort of get out all of my energy on politics there, and I feel less of a need to do it on YouTube. Also because I just feel like YouTube has more than enough sort of political cranks and crackpots, and I don't feel like that's a sort of void that needs to be filled. There's plenty of people doing political stuff, and actually, frankly, as I get older, my own thoughts on political commentary are starting to become a bit more nuanced, and I start to become, a little bit more critical of just this whole idea of sort of the talking head pundit as even being that inherently useful as a sort of contributor to our democratic culture and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, with my YouTube channel, I tried to create an image of somebody who is, moderate and neutral and accessible, and like I really indulge that side of myself. Whereas with my post column, I try to create more of an image of somebody who is, partisan and opinionated and has divisive sort of takes on contentious political topics and politicians. Those are two different sides of my personality, and to be honest, I'm kind of proud that I've been able to sort of separate those two and keep these two realms relatively independent. And a lot of people that watch my YouTube videos have no idea that I do this column or completely disinterested in it. And likewise in the other direction, a lot of people that know me for my columns don't really know or care about my YouTube channel.
How long before you actually knew that the YouTube channel had some traction and this is something that you should really be putting? So did you have a video that kind of popped, or was there a particular subject which did well? Or was it just putting in work, and then over time, before you knew it, you were building an audience?
It's a good question, because, and it sounds kind of dumb when I say it like this, but honestly, in the early days, like I just was not paying that close of attention to the metrics and stuff, because I guess it was like, I'm 37, so like I grew up at a time when like YouTube was not a big thing, right? And I think that frankly, a lot of people sort of our generation, I think we're all sort of broadly in the same bucket as far as that goes. Like there was often a somewhat even condescending attitude towards YouTube, where like YouTube was kind of silly and frivolous and dumb. And I actually remember that there was an Onion headline some years ago, like in the early 2000s, where it's like YouTube management challenges users, can you make a good video? Right? Like that was like, that was like the attitude at one time. And so as a result, I feel like I just didn't really understand really seriously what YouTube success was like. I was doing this more to make content for the audience of like my blog or people that had known me from television or from Twitter and that kind of thing. And like I said, it sounds fake to sort of say it this way, but like I can't even remember. Like I can't remember how successful or unsuccessful my earlier videos were. I can't remember sort of like when I had a big hit or what that would have been. You know, when I look back at my most successful videos, some of them are quite old. You know, I think my national anthem one was my first video that got over 1 million, but I don't really remember exactly when that happened, or I don't remember how popular that video was at the time. Now, of course, I'm super up to date with all this kind of stuff, and I know when a video is successful or not, but I feel like it's really only been in the last maybe sort of 2 or 3 years that I've really started to sort of like think of myself. I am primarily a YouTuber. This is increasingly like my dominant profession. I've sort of shifted into this realm away from the sort of pretense of opinion journalism, which was previously how I sort of defined a lot of my identity.
Is that how you introduce yourself now? Or like when people are like, what do you do? You're like, I'm a YouTuber. And some other stuff, but I'm a YouTuber primarily.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends somewhat on the audience that you're talking to, right?
Yes.
Because, you know, if I talk to younger people, I can say I'm a YouTuber and they immediately grasp the significance of that. If I'm talking to older people, I can say I'm a columnist at the Washington Post and they grasp the significance of that. But there is often a little bit of confusion because you tell them...
The secret is to have several things depending on the audience to tell them and make it resonate for them.
Well, yeah, it's like, you know... I'm sure you guys have this experience all the time, right? Like you talk to older people or even, you know, people in our sort of realm and it's like, YouTube, oh, can you make money doing that?
Yeah,
like,
that's always the first question.
Yeah.
I say it's a production company when I'm talking to people who don't know YouTube.
Yes.
It's like, we do a production company, we produce videos. Oh, that's interesting. But if it's a younger person, it's like, it's a YouTube channel.
Yes. No, it's remarkable. Like it's such a cultural transformation that this is now the dominant medium for a certain generation sort of below us, right? Like it's wild. You look at the, you know, when you're at the drugstore or whatever, and you look at like the cover of those teen magazines, you know, oh, who's the latest heartthrob? And it's all like these weird like YouTube people that like I've never heard of before. Yep. But that's how the youth of today consume media, right?
You have an interesting perspective from somebody unlike we've had before, where you have experienced old media and new media, but the old media, you've done both television and printed material and blogs. You've kind of done it all. Do you think that all of that kind of media is just eventually just going to die out?
Well, it's funny. I remember I was once at a sort of journalism conference back in the day, and the guy sort of was talking about the future of journalism, and he sort of said, like, you know, the three rules is that nobody wants to read what they can listen to, and no one wants to listen to what they can watch. And I do think that you kind of do see that trend. When you look at media, like establishment sort of media outlets, they are all pushing video increasingly in a way that they used to. You know, and at first they were pushing bloggers. It's like, okay, we can have like, our websites will be constantly updating, we'll have sort of running commentary, constantly refreshing. And then that was sort of like the hot thing for a time. And then it was like, okay, we'll all do podcasts, we'll all do audio content, you know, we'll have the articles written to you and so on and so forth. And now I think what you're sort of seeing, and particularly with sort of with new startup media, the assumption right off the bat, you know, Vox or something like that, it's like, okay, we got to have like video content. It has to be video based. We have to have, you know, we're either on YouTube or we have some sort of proprietary sort of video system on our own website. But it's true. And I mean, like, I don't necessarily see this as like the decline and fall of journalism, because I think that there's, when you look at YouTube itself, you see tremendous sort of investigative journalism, investigative reporting, investigative commentary that's done through the medium and is able to tell a story with a kind of richness that you couldn't do strictly in print or strictly through audio. And, you know, there's a lot of schlock that's being put up there in that sort of has a pseudo journalistic pretense, but is clearly not. But there's also a lot of really good stuff. So I think that this is a sort of exciting age. And I mean, this is part of the reason why I do what I do, is that I feel like I want to make use of this medium. I want to sort of use it to kind of be somewhat entrepreneurial, somewhat, you know, pioneering, sort of help steer the course of like what the sort of topics that I'm interested in, how those can be fully explored using the medium of YouTube, using the medium of video, and also, you know, I think, model some sort of responsibility to the younger people that are consuming it as well. Like, you want to sort of show people that it is possible to use this medium not just for sort of frivolous entertainment, but also for substantial or thoughtful conversations and discussions and discourses and, analysis of heady matters that matter to people.
And now YouTube is the #1 job aspiration for kids that are polled, which is pretty amazing. And I think about when I started posting videos, there were people who are posting videos on YouTube now who weren't even born when I was posting videos, who were 13 years old and they're making videos. It's just crazy. So they've just grown up with this. And a lot of this is generational, because I haven't watched a TV newscast in really years. It's just not something I do that is so kind of out of my realm of existence. But I was visiting my dad a couple of years ago, and he had the news on. Yes. And it's been a long time since I'd seen it. And I was just kind of taken aback by how just sensationalistic it was. And it was just all about these visuals. Here's a fire, here's an explosion, here's all this stuff happening that wasn't really news. It was just more things that happened that looked cool on video.
Yes. And like you see this, like, this is how the press, or the sort of like the standard mainstream press, is sort of in a bit of a desperate state, right? Like, they need to sort of keep people engaged at a time when their audience is drifting away to these newer, flashier, I mean, we shouldn't even say, I sound like such an old man sort of using these, this newfangled internet that all the kids are on now. No, but it's true. Like, there is a lot, and I know this, like, having been in newsrooms and stuff, there is a lot of anxiety about people moving to the new medium, and that if you work in television, and I'm, my story, like, someday when I'm an actual, like, really old man, it'll be a good story, because I can say that I worked for a news station, and at a time when everybody at the news station knew that this was not a business model to bet on. Like, television news, and this is why Sun News, the network I worked for in Canada, was, like, looking back at it in retrospect, like, it was just the completely wrong decision at the wrong time. Like, Canada did not need a new television news station. There was no way that this was going to be a sustainable business model. The amount of money you have to put up front in order to sort of prop it up and keep people engaged. And, you have a very old audience as a result, and that audience is, sort of fading in various ways. But, no, if you're interested in these sorts of things, if you're interested in having conversations about public affairs and public policy and that kind of stuff, I think you have to, kind of get with the times and have to have strategies for dealing with YouTube. And you see a lot of these people who were very stubborn and very in denial about this kind of thing in establishment newsrooms, and are still often in denial. They still feel that they can make it work just with their website or just with their podcast, and just don't have a video or a video strategy. And if they do, it's often, like, very, half-assed. They just kind of, like, throw their podcast onto their YouTube channel, with no visuals or no added benefit or anything like that, or they just upload the nightly news broadcast onto the YouTube channel or things like that. No, it requires a bit more creativity than that.
I think it's important to note, anybody listening to this that isn't familiar with your content, is that up to this point, we're making it sound like you have a political commentary channel to some extent, but it's really not. You touch on politics, but from a very centrist point, at least in my mind, it's a centrist point of view. I think Chad might give me a little bit of argument about this, because we were talking about it, and he was saying, oh yeah, he's a conservative. And I'm like, whoa, I don't see that at all. And he said, well, there's a difference between Canadian conservatives and American conservatives. And I'm like, no, I think that JJ seems to me very centrist.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, I don't really think that there's that much difference between Canadian conservatives and American conservatives as a sort of temperament or as an ideology. I think that you can argue that the politicians perhaps present differently because, the country is different and the electorate is different. But I think that, if you spent time, like, if you had a sort of stereotypical Republican voter and a stereotypical conservative voter, you put them in a room together, they'd agree on far more than they would disagree with. Because, politics of left and right, it's primarily, I think, driven by disposition and driven by personality more than any sort of fixed sort of set of public policies. And that being said, I do sort of feel like one of the reasons why I identified as a conservative when I was a younger person was because of a certain disposition that I understood myself to have. And a disposition I still think I have, which is, cautious and pragmatic and, hesitant about radical change, hesitant certainly about sort of radical kind of left-wing rhetoric and so on and so forth. But definitely these days, I feel like I'm getting a little bit more alienated from what is being offered as conservatism, which I think is, I don't want to get sort of too political on your channel because that's not what this is all about. But definitely I think that the understanding of what that ideology means has changed somewhat. And even though I still feel like my own disposition is the same as it has always been, in some ways, like, I want to use that disposition towards different ends rather than sort of pushing for, explicitly conservative politicians or goals or whatnot, which I might be increasingly alienated from. I instead just kind of want to offer a channel that is in some ways like, it's not explicitly conservative, it's not explicitly left, it's just kind of moderate in a kind of conservative temperamental way. Like it's hopefully thoughtful, it's hopefully sort of somewhat pragmatic, it's hopefully somewhat fair and balanced. These are sort of what I think of as being sort of classical conservative virtues in a sort of small c sense, rather than kind of capital C partisan, conservative
Donald
party
Trump. You're right.
yeah, or Republican Party, conservative party, like that kind of conservatism. So, I mean, but that said, like, I don't want to get too on my high horse here. I do consider myself a relatively partisan conservative in the context of Canadian politics. If people want to read my Washington Post columns, they can hear what I think about Prime Minister Trudeau and that whole set. But it's not what the channel's all about.
Do you actually have a mix or an organization system for your content? And how do you break down kind of like not getting yourself too kind of trapped into one particular subject or doing too many videos about flags or something like that?
Yeah, people
I love the flag videos.
I mean, yes, I love the flag videos too. But how do you not get locked into what we were just talking about, where it's like, hey, it's more than, just politics. I have more that I want to talk about.
Yeah, so I mean, at the beginning of in the intro, you sort of said, you recited sort of the catchphrase I use on my channel banner, which is like, I talk about countries, culture, and Canada. And I try to create videos that sort of fit under one of those sort of three broad sort of columns. So, and I do try to mix it up. Like, I try to be very self-aware when I'm drifting too much into one direction. Like, sometimes I make too many videos about Canada in a row, and then I'm kind of like, okay, I need to ratchet that back, maybe start doing some more videos about culture, or videos about other countries, even countries outside of North America, which I sometimes do as well. But I do take that seriously because I do feel like one problem that I've often seen happen to YouTubers, and I'm sure you guys have observed this in many times as well, is that, a YouTuber starts making a variety of different content on a variety of different topics, and then they make a video on one particular topic that really catches fire. And then so they start replicating that success. And then the subsequent videos are also popular, and then they just kind of get trapped in this cycle where they're only making that one type of video on that one type of content. And then before they know it, they kind of get stuck in this sort of cul-de-sac that they can often find very unsatisfying, because it's like, well, I did like this subject at one time. Here, I'll give you a concrete example, because this is I won't name the YouTuber, but I remember feeling sort of sad about
was
this
it
guy's story.
Steve Ramsey?
It was Steve Ramsey. I bet you it was Steve Ramsey.
No, it was not. It was a guy who did fashion YouTube, like men's fashion, which is something I'm interested in. And he would do videos about outfits and all this kind of stuff. And then one day he did like mystery box, ordered a mystery box of clothes from eBay. And then, the audience went nuts for that. And then so he did like another mystery box of mystery clothes from eBay. And then audience went nuts for that as well. And then he would occasionally try to do like his old style of content, just fashion reviews, outfit tips, and that sort of thing. Like no one would view those. More mystery boxes. And then so like the channel is just kind of stuck in this, like I said, just kind of stuck in this cul-de-sac of only making this one type of very niche, very specific content that is clearly not what this creator got into the business to do. And I'm very afraid of that ever happening to me. Like, I would never want to wake up one day and then just be like, I'm just the flag guy. And if I try to talk about anything else, the audience won't be receptive to it. So instead, what I've tried to do is just try to build a brand, I suppose, that's based around myself and my way of communicating and my way of analyzing things, to the point where I would hope that my audience is like primarily interested in JJ and interested in JJ's analysis and commentary on a wide variety of topics, to the point where they would trust me, like even if they don't think the topic is maybe that interesting at first, but they have enough loyalty to me that they would trust me to handle it well and create some engaging content based around that. And when I think of content creators that I really like and I admire, I have the same sort of relationship with them. It's like I'm primarily loyal to you, the creator, and I trust you to make engaging content on a broad variety of topics, as opposed to just being in this very narrow transactional relationship where it's like mystery boxes are nothing. If you're not giving me that, I have no time for you because I'm only there.
As a viewer, it's far more interesting to follow a channel like yours where I don't know exactly what to expect next, but I know what the quality of that content is going to be like. And I know that it's going to engage me throughout the entire video, which is because I think I found your channel from you had a video on minimalist caricatures. I don't know why thank you, YouTube. It showed up in my stream, and I watched it and I thought how fascinating this is that you can, do a caricature of somebody. Charlie Chaplin would be an instance of one of those with just a few lines. People know it's Charlie Chaplin. And from that video, all of a sudden, your other videos are getting suggested, and I started watching those, which led to your flag videos. JJ is a vexillologist. I only recently learned that word. Is that right? Is it right?
I actually, on my channel, I use the phrase flag spurt, which I think is more
I like that better.
That's awesome. What does the breakdown of a video look like for you? How does it go from just an idea to you uploading a video onto the internet?
So I have a pretty rigid sort of weekly schedule. So I upload every Saturday morning, so that's kind of like the set calibration point. And then sort of by Sunday, I'm already sort of, throughout the week, I'm always kind of thinking of ideas in the background. But, certainly by Sunday, I'm pretty committed to a topic. And then by Monday, I work on the script if I haven't already started working on the script in the background. But basically, the script has to be done by Monday, at least. And then I film on Tuesday. Filming is, like, by far the thing I hate the most doing. So that's kind of, like, the most painful day of the week. And then on Wednesday, I write my column for the Washington Post. And I actually have a young fellow in Toronto who I outsource part of the editing to. What I do is that I do a million takes of every line. Like, I am just so bad. This is why I hate filming, right? Like, I constantly flub my own lines. So I script it, and then I'm reading from the teleprompter. But I'm constantly stumbling over my lines, and I do so many takes of every single line that you see in my video. And at some point, it's just like, and then when I used to go to edit it, I would just get so hung up on it. It's like, is that take better than this take? And it just drove me nuts. So I outsourced that responsibility to some other person. And he goes through it and he extracts all of the best takes and then smushes them all together for me. And he does that on Wednesday in the background while I'm working on my column. So it's a good sort of distribution of labor in that way. On Thursday, he sends it to me. And then all day Thursday, all day Friday, I do the actual editing. So I add the visuals and the sound effects and all of that kind of stuff. And then,
that's
hopefully
it's an interesting way of editing. Yeah, to have to just have somebody just to find the good footage of you talking. I'm surprised that you struggle with the reading as much, coming from a TV background where I presume you were reading, although if you were a commentator, you may not have been reading from a teleprompter.
No, because it's like this sort of thing, like I'm very in my element about, like sort of spontaneous conversation on any sort of topic. Like that's what I was sort of trained to do. But like I'm not an actor, right? Like, and I feel like in some ways YouTube is in some ways sort of more geared towards sort of like the actor type, because it is much more about, well, at least a certain type. I mean, some people are very spontaneous on YouTube, but in terms of the kind of content that I want to do, reading a script, like that's not something that I have great skill or background in. So it's challenging for me.
I assumed that was an important thing because you were talking about such fact-based, you're sharing so much information that you really want to be certain that you don't get the words lost in the nuance of the way that you communicate them. We find we do that with cleaning videos, even though it's very simple. It's best to write it down and just read those directions as opposed to just like off the cuff try to. However, with all of that being said, do you like the thought of coming up with an idea a few days before you actually need to shoot it, or do you like being well scheduled and knowing what you're doing well in advance?
So like I have, an app in my phone where I sort of have a list of topics I theoretically want to do at some point in the future. But I suppose like the column writing business has trained me well for this kind of thing, because, when you're writing a column, a weekly column, you kind of can't think too far in advance because you don't really know what's going to be in the news that week. And so you are kind of a little bit more sort of spontaneous. And I kind of feel like my mind is just kind of frozen in that practice. And so when I'm making videos, it's the same way. Even though theoretically I have lots of ideas I want to get along to, it's usually just through the process of working on one video that something provokes me to think about what I want to do for the following week. And so it becomes just this kind of chain reaction kind of stuff. So I don't think about it too far in advance. Like even right now when I'm talking to you, like I don't know what my next week video is going to be. Something will occur to me naturally, as column ideas occur to me naturally through the course of going about my life and working on the videos that I'm working on right now. But yeah, I'm not, and this is sort of part of my disposition as a person. I'm just very bad at long-term planning, good at sort of short-term week to week. But yeah, I don't know.
By the way, congratulations on the success of your shorts. Those things are killing it.
Oh, thank you. I love shorts. I know they're very controversial.
I do too. I love doing them. I know. At first, people didn't care much for them when I started posting, but I just doubled down, and now they like them, and I love doing them. It's a lot of fun.
There's something, again, it's sort of like, it's like column writing in a way. Like when you write a column, you have to deal with a word count, right?
Right.
So you like, this is a thing that young writers often struggle with, and you see this a lot in like college newspapers or blogs, to the extent that those still exist, right? It's like young people often, it's like, well, every thought I have is worth expressing, and if it takes me 3,000 words to like write about like who should win the election, like that's how long it's going to take me to do it. And then when you work for a newspaper, they have a very hard limit. They say like you can write 750 words, no more, because it back in the day it wouldn't literally fit on the page. And that's a very that kind of discipline, I think, forces you to be much more economical in your words, much more sort of hopefully eloquent and to the point. And it's just, I think it's a very useful practice. And I think that there's a similar sort of phenomenon that's happening on YouTube right now, particularly in sort of the like pseudo-intellectual commentary, political philosophy YouTube, where people just make these agonizingly long videos. It's like an hour.
They're getting
more.
Longer, aren't they?
And it's like more is not always better, right? And the thing about shorts is that they remind me in some ways of like writing a column, because like with a short, I've now sort of figured this out through trial and error. It takes me about 170 words is the most I can sort of cram into a short. But I love that challenge. Like I love the challenge. Can I make a point in 170 words? Can I explain a concept in 170 words? And then you think about the visuals, which obviously add a great deal to it as well. But that kind of discipline, I think, is very good, is very healthy. It stimulates me creatively, intellectually, and I think more people should give it a try. Even people who think that like shorts are too frivolous, like it's too much like TikTok. It's like, no, think about it in a little bit more. Think of it as a challenge that you have to try to meet.
That is so interesting you say that, because we were just having this conversation last week with a guest that we haven't actually posted his podcast yet, but I see those as the exact same challenge. I try to limit myself to 150 words. Maybe I don't speak quite as fast as you do, but it's, to me, that's an incredible fun challenge to just try to whittle down one specific topic, in my case, a woodworking tip or a trick or something interesting, in 150 words, and to just get that out, it's very satisfying. Yeah,
absolutely. And I would do it like regardless of what the limitation was. Like if YouTube came out tomorrow and said like, we've got this new thing, YouTube black and whites, you can only make black and white videos, like that would be equally sort of engaging to me. I do think limitation is a real sort of font of creativity.
I want YouTube black and whites now. That's a great idea. So simple.
Yeah.
Talk about thecanadianguide.com, because during my research, clearly I came across all of your wonderful social media platforms, but I came across this wonderful website. And even as a Canadian, I learned so much. How did that come about, and what was the drive behind that?
That's, I suppose, one of my oldest creative projects. I actually started making that when I was in high school. I would talk to, international people online, and, they'd be very interested in Canada. And I wanted, like, could I make like a good sort of reference guide that I could just send them to? It's like, if you want to learn some basic stuff about Canada, read this. And I was always interested when I was younger in like travel guides and textbooks. And I'm still very interested in sort of like, clear educational resources. Clear communication, I think, is like one of the biggest sort of themes of what I've devoted my professional life to. And I wanted to make a clean, clear, simple guide to Canada. I started doing it, like I said, in high school, and I've since been working on it for years and years and years. And the version that you see online today is sort of the culmination of years of work. I hired a very expensive graphic designer to make a really elegant layout for the website. I update it all the time. I was just updating it this morning with the information on our new Governor General. But I think that, clear, good nonfiction writing, nonfiction resources, was something that the internet used to be all about. Like, people used to make good websites about topics, amateur people would make websites. I'm sure you can probably remember that there was good websites about woodworking and stuff like that back in the day. But now, the internet is a very different place. And it's sort of like, the analogy I liked is that somebody sort of said that we now kind of live in the internet with Wikipedia as kind of the Walmart, like it's the one-stop shop. It's put all the small businesses, like all the small businesses, the amateur websites are now out of business. Nobody really has an incentive to compete with Wikipedia. It's just this kind of behemoth that has drowned out everything else. I personally really do not like Wikipedia. I never read it. I never actually have installed parental blocking software on my computer, so I can't visit it if I wanted to. So I don't use it for my videos. And I wanted to create, in some ways, like an online reference website about Canada that could provide information, just basic sort of facts about Canadian civics, the parliamentary system and, different Canadian foods and the different flags and all this kind of stuff, but in a way that was an alternative to Wikipedia and was perhaps had some advantages that Wikipedia didn't have. Perhaps the writing was a little bit more clear and concise, and
some pictures, maybe some pictures and some design, and maybe a menu which helped organize the information as opposed to random links in an article. I'm with you on that, and I love the analogy of Wikipedia kind of being a Walmart. And the reason why I even brought up the website is because I was so impressed that it is just as informative as I'm sure the Wikipedia pages about Canada are, but it's presented in such a much more digestible fashion that makes it. And it did. I started my first web design company in 1998. So I remember the days of building niche websites, just niche websites. And that's where everybody used to go. But you're right, YouTube. Now, the YouTube channel, I think, took over the niche website. Now everybody's like, figures out how to fix their flat tire by watching a YouTube video as opposed to going to a how-to website.
Yeah. No, that's a fair point.
Let me ask you both a question about Canada.
All right.
Since you guys are obviously the experts on Canada, what if you had to pick one, what do you think is the one biggest misconception people from outside of Canada have about Canada?
I think, and this is the great thesis that I've devoted a lot of my my public commentary life to, is I think that Canadians and Americans are not different. Like, I think that we are basically the same people. I think that we have a sort of shared continental civilization, and I think that people on both sides of the border are in a fair bit of denial about that basic reality. I think that, a lot of Canadian nationalism has been defined by an attempt to define an identity for this country defined strictly in opposition to America through often, I think, crude and distasteful anti-Americanism, anti-American stereotypes and judgment and that sort of thing. And that's something that I've always been really opposed to. And I have, like I said, I feel like through my columns, my commentary, even my YouTube channel, I'm really against that conception of Canada. I think that Canada and America are the two most similar countries in the world. And I think that that's a great virtue for Canada. And I think that we should be proud in how much we are like Americans, not focus obsessively on the ways that we are different, and not sort of lie to the rest of the world too, and sort of play up differences that I think are often quite marginal in the contrast of the vastly more numerous and significant sames that we share.
You're on the spot, Chad.
Oh man, I think the whole thought about Canadians being this incredibly polite group of people who are well-mannered and nice and super everything, it's just such a broad stereotype that when you run into an asshole Canadian, you're like, oh, wait, yeah, that's right. We're not all nice. We don't always apologize to each other and whatnot. And it comes from a place, it seems weird that that's kind of like our biggest identity. And not that it's right or wrong. It's just like, that sucks. The biggest thing that we're known for is just we're nice people.
But you see, that is unto itself, though, simply an outgrowth of a certain sort of anti-Americanism, right? Because, more polite, what does that mean? More polite than who? All of these sort of stereotypes about Canadians being a certain way as a people always have an implicit, unlike those dirty Americans, right?
Right.
That's always the unspoken sort of second half of any conception of Canadian identity. And I just think that that's terrible. I think that, we all, sometimes I get a little utopian about this, but, we're all people. We all live on the same earth. We all have to sort of get along with one another. And I don't think that if Canadians, cannot model sort of a responsible cohabitation with their next door neighbors, of people that, for all intents and purposes, we're culturally indistinguishable from, then what hope is there for anyone else in the world? What right do we have to go around the world and tell people to, stop their civil wars and stop feuding and fighting if we cannot even conceptualize an identity with our own neighbors that is based on something other than just hate and stereotypes? So that's something I do believe very strongly.
And it's hard to be a really nice, humble Canadian when a lot of Canadians have such unspoken, that was really well worded, unspoken hatred or just like disdain towards America and Americans and just like that culture. And that ends up being the culture itself. Because you dislike something else, like that's now what you stand for.
Define yourself based on what you're not.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's I've heard some Americans refer to Canada as just basically America light. It's like, well, it is America, but it's not really that, and so I think Americans have a way of dismissing Canada just as equally, although I think Canada is the new Hollywood.
Well, there definitely, there is elements of that. There is sort of stereotyping, and as somebody that's sort of been in sort of conservative spaces and dealt with sort of conservative Americans, I know that there is kind of this stereotype that Canada is this sort of left-wing crackpot country, and everything's nuts up here, and the socialists have really had their run of the place. And yeah, obviously that's false. But I think it's also false too, and I deal with this actually a lot with my own audience, because my audience is primarily Americans that are interested in Canada. I've actually been rejected by advertisers for not having a large enough Canadian audience, which is kind of remarkable.
Which is so funny.
Yeah, but part of the thing too is that there are a lot of Americans, and I think well motivated, that want Canada to be more different than it is. Right? This is actually something that you even read about in tour guides written for Americans. It's they sort of say, well, be aware it's going to be pretty much like what you're used to back home. Don't expect people. I think Americans want they want the world to be an exciting and dynamic and interesting place, and I think that sometimes Americans get a little bit upset at the so-called Americanization of the world, where everybody's sort of drinking the same soda pops and watching the same movies and this sort of thing. But that's a triumph of American success, a triumph of American culture, and Canada has been even more so subsumed by that than any other country in the world, just because, we've always had an incredibly porous border. Families have always lived on both sides of the border, come and gone, not thought much of it. People move across the border for work opportunities and all sorts of different things. And frankly, I think that YouTube has been a great equalizer of that as well. You see so many YouTubers who are Canadian and yet do not present in an ostentatiously Canadian way, because to most normal Canadians, it doesn't occur to them to present in that way. It's really only this kind of insecure, kind of very heavily politicized people that I think put this kind of anti-American Canadianism at the front of their personal identity and personal brand. And I frankly think that the fact that, I've written about this in the post as well, the fact that YouTube has been such a tremendous sort of success for Canadians, I think in some ways kind of reveals the big lie about sort of Canadian nationalism, which is that the Canadians can only be successful within Canada if they talk about particularly Canadian topics to a Canadian audience. It's right. It's no, Canadians can actually be tremendously international superstars because of our ability to talk about broadly accessible topics that are interesting not only to Americans but the world at large.
Let me follow that up by asking you, what's your favorite thing about being a Canadian?
My favorite thing about being a Canadian, well, this is a wonderful country. It's a wonderful free country. I love the freedom that I enjoy as a Canadian. I'm incredibly grateful for it. My sister lived for many years in the Middle East, and I often thought about that. My sister lived in a part of the world where you just could not be the kind of person that I am. So I'm openly gay. I'm a person that's made my life criticizing the government. I sort of speak my mind freely to a mass audience through mass media. These are tremendous, tremendous freedoms that so many people around the world just do not have. And I will always be eternally grateful that I won one of life's great lotteries to be born in this country and be able to make, a living for myself, being my authentic self and just doing what I love to do. So it's an incredible blessing. And you sort of said at the beginning that, I have this sort of spiel in my aboot part of my YouTube channel where I say that life is about living life with the right mix of gratitude. And I think you can be irreverent about your country. I think you can be critical of your country, but you should always be very grateful when you live in a wonderful free country like this to never lose sight of what a tremendous blessing you have.
You reference a quote from, I think it was Douglas Copeland, and he talks about how you had a continent before, and then you split it up into countries.
Yeah.
You have Canada and you have U.S. and how little thought was put into that. And how
Yes.
could you please explain a little bit of the backstory about how Canada and the U.S. kind of like drew that line?
Well, I mean, it's just a completely arbitrary colonial border. I mean, anybody that looks, I've got a map of Canada right beside me right now. I'm just looking at it, and it's like, you have a sort of natural border in the east, sort of based around the Great Lakes and some of that. But then, like, for the vast majority of the Canadian border, it's just this big, like, ruler line that was cleaved across the continent with no regard for geography or settlement or anything like that. And it was just a colonial border that was just negotiated by the British and the Americans in the 19th century. It was just kind of like, well, we want to maintain peaceful relations between the British Empire and the United States of America, and therefore, like, there was negotiations and there was talks about it, and they were just kind of, like, settled on this line, the 49th parallel, and it's like, so be it. It's no different than many of the arbitrary colonial borders that you see drawn in Africa or the Middle East, and I think we should be just as critical of it. Before, certainly, obviously, if we go back far enough, the indigenous people didn't have this border. And none of the sort of indigenous tribes or nations are divided by it. But also, even once settlement did come, I mean, we sort of lose track of this, is just how people kind of just settled kind of broadly across the continent, and they didn't respect this line because it's an imaginary line. It doesn't exist. It didn't define culture. It didn't define families. It didn't define anything. It was just a kind of imaginary thing that some colonial bureaucrats drew. And I think it's important that we be critical of that, and that we examine it with the same sort of second guessing that I think we examine a lot of sort of colonially imposed things. I mean, the sort of cliche that sort of more contrarian people like myself will often say is that, you think of, like, I live here in Vancouver. I have far more in common with somebody who lives in Seattle than I do with somebody who lives over in Toronto or Newfoundland, or to say nothing of Quebec or Montreal. So, and I think that most Canadians and most Americans, like, if sort of confronted, would say the same sort of thing, right? Like, as a guy from San Francisco, you probably have much more in common with other people in British Columbia than you do with, someone in rural Alabama, right? So it's these ideas that this arbitrary colonial ruler line cleaving the continent in twain is somehow like the thing that we should use to sort of orient our sense of identity and culture and place, I think is just completely wrong.
Let's talk about a couple of topics you've brought up on your channel. First of all, I want to talk about your video on the kind of the fight over the pride flag symbol. I've lived in San Francisco for over 30 years, and it's very commonly seen everywhere. But it's only recently that we're seeing this pull from different entities kind of wanting to take control over what I learned from your video, which I had never thought about before, is that the pride flag is a folk icon. It's like Santa Claus. It's basically public domain. Anybody can use this, and that I would be a little bit upset when I'd see corporations using the pride flag to sell products. But then after watching your video, I started thinking about it differently, that in a way, this is sort of a good thing, that the flag has become such a common, it's become normalized. And to see corporations using that, in a way, is a sign of progress. Is that what I get from that?
That's basically sort of my take. I mean, I feel, and the part of the reason why I made that video was because I feel like the dominant take, the sort of easy take that I think a lot of people offer, somewhat sort of thoughtlessly, is this idea that, like, the pride flag has been corporatized and all of these corporations are slapping it on their logos, every June, and trying to make a quick buck from the gays and this sort of thing. And, like, fair enough, there's I suppose some substance to that critique, but the point that I wanted to make was the point that I thought is rarely made publicly, which is that sort of, like, particularly, like, as a gay man myself, it's like, it's nice to be able to take a step back and say, like, this is actually something kind of heroic. It's something tremendously impressive and a real sign of progress, that now you can have every random bank and cookie store and, Goldman Sachs and all the rest of these, like, that they put that now it is almost more controversial to not signal your support for the LGBT community than it is to do it. And, like, being from a generation where I grew up at a time when I was in high school, like, nobody was openly gay, and, like, it was still seen as this very sort of taboo and kind of avant-garde thing that only those people did. And like growing up, I was and I talked about this in the video, like I was alienated from the pride flag because I saw it as a symbol of like those people. And like, sort of insecure teenage JJ didn't want to be one of those people. He wanted to be normal. He wanted to sort of conform with the mainstream sort of bourgeois middle class white Canadian culture that he was born into. And so now that the fact that you're using the pride flag in such a tremendous diversity of circumstances, not only like, in progressive circles, but in these kind of like bourgeois sort of places, like, you go to Walmart and you see the pride flag, right? We underestimate just what a normalizing effect that has on people that perhaps are a little bit less progressive, perhaps a little bit less sort of activist in their kind of sensibilities, but need to sort of feel included just as much as anyone else. So I'm my contrarian take is that pride flags on corporate logos are good, actually.
I like that you approach topics from a lot of topics from a skeptical point of view and not a cynical point of view. And did you ever watch Penn and Teller's Bullshit? Did you ever watch that show?
Yeah. I'm sort of broadly familiar with it, yeah.
Some of what you do reminds me. In fact, you even had a topic that they covered on that one time, which was about this kind of the fraud of recycling and how we're just basically creating a bunch of trash by throwing it in the blue bin.
Yes.
But you feel good doing it. You feel so good doing it.
Right? You really do.
Because now you don't need to worry about it anymore. Now it's in the blue bin.
Yeah, it just reminded me of their videos. But yeah, tell people about that, the whole myth of recycling. And is there any way we can get out of this thing?
I mean,
can we fix it?
Well, I mean, like,
I want to do good. I want to put the stuff in the blue bin. And I do. And I take it out to the street every day. And then I find out, well, it's just basically all going to be burned up.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that, this is the problem with climate change and environmental issues in general, is that they require a very significant lifestyle change that most of us are just not prepared to do. We just kind of are looking for shortcuts. So really, like, the only way that you can be a good sort of recycler, so to speak, is by literally recycling objects in your own life, right? So if you reuse the same tote bag, for the next 30 years, like that's productive recycling. If you buy a nice glass bottle and reuse that for drinking your water for the next 30 years, like that's productive recycling. What's not productive recycling is to just buy like, plastic bottles and then just heave them in a tub, because we know, and the video sort of deconstructs this in great detail, is that what happens is that we mostly just ship those things over to China or to other countries in Asia and say, hey, you people make stuff. I'm sure you can figure out something to do with this plastic, right? But in most cases they can't, because the plastic is so low quality, and the process of melting it down obviously degrades the quality of it even further. But, it's also all covered with, glue and food scraps. And, the amount of effort that it takes to even like render this stuff clean is unto itself a tremendous time investment, and time is money, but then also the resources that it requires to, ship things and, operate the machines that clean and melt and so on and so forth. Like there's often no net benefit at all to this process. And it's
when you fill up that recycle bin, there is literally people at a conveyor belt who have to go through and hand pick the good stuff.
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
just so labor intensive to deal with all of this.
Yes, absolutely. And then there's always like a desire to sort of cut corners because of how expensive this process is, which is why we just sort of outsource it all to Asian countries. And increasingly, Asian countries don't even want to play along. Like in the Philippines and China, they have said quite explicitly, like, stop sending us your garbage. Like, it's not our job to kind of like alleviate your guilt, right? Like to somehow sort of do the penance that way. People have made the argument as well that like a lot of this has also just been a kind of just very sophisticated PR campaign that was sort of established by the plastics companies, right? Like at a time when they were getting increasingly negative PR for creating wasteful products, they kind of dreamed up this idea, that, oh, we stamp this little circular arrow. That means that you can recycle it. Therefore, don't feel guilty. Buy as much plastic as you want. It's all going to a good place. So I don't know. It's that video of mine is quite popular. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I think that's an example of kind of the breadth of topics that I can cover, like talking about flag design one day and recycling policy the next.
And the Mandela effect. I remember a few years ago when this was all the rage, everybody was saying, "Ooh, there's the Mandela effect. We're we're seeing things differently than we used to see them. And they always would bring up the same examples, the Berenstain Bears and, you know, the different logos. Ooh, did you notice that I don't know what logo has changed? It's not the same as I remember it. And it's just faulty memory is all it is.
Yes.
Thoroughly debunked. People still believe in the Mandela effect.
No, it's so ludicrous, and it's troublesome because it is mostly like sort of young people that seem to buy into this, and this is sort of like, this is a dark and sort of cynical side of YouTube. You know, I remember you were talking with the Australian woman who did the entertainment for the children some time
Bounce
ago.
Patrol, Shannon.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great episode, right? And you talked a little bit about the kind of the Elsa Gate kind of sort of thing, right? Where like people make horrible content for kids, but there's also horrible content for like preteens and like young sort of teenagers and stuff. And I view like some of the Mandela effect as basically just being like the older version of that kind of Elsa Gate type of content, right? Where it's like people that know better push like crackpot conspiracy theories or like stuff about ghosts and mysteries and, you know, this kind of stuff where it's like, hey kids, isn't this cool and mysterious and weird? And it like puts in like a kind of seed of like very destructive conspiratorial thinking into sort of young people that are still just trying to grasp their understanding of the adult world. And stuff like Mandela effect, and, you know, I talk about this in my video on it, and I show like other channels that, you know, use Mandela effect in order to get clicks and say to like these young people, it's like, hey, like, could there be alternative universes? Could like we be living in a simulation? Has our universe collided with a parallel one? And like this kind of rubbish, like it's not a good thing to be filling young people's heads with. Like as opposed, particularly when there's an Occam's razor explanation, which is just you kind of misremembered this very trivial thing, right? You were misremembered how to spell a children's book character that, you know, you probably weren't paying that close attention to in the first place because those stories are mostly boring and some adult was reading it to you in the library or whatever, right? Like that's the explanation.
You decided to put this one on a pedestal and make this one be the important thing, which is proof for an alternative universe and like, you know, other shifty. And you're right. I've noticed a lot of children. I have a 3-year-old and she loves going through YouTube. And there's a lot of children's content directed directly at children, which is very, like you say, ghosts, monster, just a whole unnecessary added element to their stories and to their videos and their entertainment. And and you're right, it does seem slightly disingenuous.
Even the name itself, the Mandela effect, is kind of, if you kind of buy into that, you're kind of admitting that you're basically haven't been paying attention throughout your life.
Well, I talk a bit about that in the video too, right? Because like that's the origin of it, right?
Yeah.
Like the origin is that some people thought Nelson Mandela had died when he hadn't, right? And I talk about that in the video. Like that is an extraordinarily ignorant opinion to have ever
to just
held.
admit that is stupid.
Yes, because Mandela was one of the great statesmen of the 20th century. Like he was all over the place all the time. He was even when he was like still under oppression in South Africa. Like he was a very important political figure. So if you thought that he was dead, that just shows that you were like completely sort of checked out of you know, reality. And I guess some people are just too proud to admit that they were that dumb. So it's just like, no, actually, I think the world just kind of revolved around me in some way, and that there must have been a parallel universe in which I was right, because that makes more sense.
There has to be another explanation. Exactly.
Yeah.
One of your videos was about how society has changed since your childhood, or anybody's childhood, how you see. Well, a lot of us think, well, obviously the technology has changed since we were kids, but society changing is what is really interesting. And it got me thinking about this whole concept of generations. And we seem to be obsessed with what generation a person is from and how we define what age. Are you a millennial? Are you a Gen X?
Yes.
Are you Gen Y? Are you a Zoomer, a Boomer? All these different things, which is just such a new concept that literally a little over maybe 150 years ago, there was no concept of that, because basically you lived out your life the exact same way your parents lived out their life. There wasn't a whole lot of difference there.
Yes. And there's a lot of really interesting sort of theories. I did 2 videos on this topic, one in which I sort of asked, I sometimes do this, is I do a sort of sequel video in which I ask the audience to share their insights, and then I read some of the best comments and sort of explore them in the follow-up video. And people have like a lot of interesting theories or evidence about where this kind of concept of these clearly delineated generations come from. A lot of it has to do with, I think, the Second World War, and that was such a transformative experience for, the generation, I think, of...
The boomers. When we think of that as like the first that we started labeling as a generation.
Yeah, because it would be sort of like the generation of like our grandparents, right, who were in the war, presumably, or, our grandmothers who, built the munitions and that sort of thing. Like, that was such a transformative experience for this broad, age range, because, of course, people of a certain age had to fight in the war, and there was an exclusionary aspect to it that was very tightly defined. And then those people come back, and then they all have kids at the same time, and, sort of like that creates a very clear break already, is that you sort of have the experience of the war generation versus the post-war generation. And then things like technology and pop culture kind of exploded after the war. You had all of these. One comment that I thought was very insightful was that sort of like the post-war generation, the boomer generation, was really the first generation that ever experienced like the concept of a distinct culture for themselves, like young people music, like rock and roll and that kind of thing. Like there was never that kind of thing previously. Like everybody just kind of listened to the same music, and American Western society was much more static in that kind of way. Whereas then you kind of had a youth culture that was defined by sharply different cultural norms, such as music and dress and clothing and stuff, which was in part sort of encouraged by the growth of like the wealth of American society post-war and that sort of thing. But the problem is that, to some extent, we're all kind of forever living in the boomers' world, right? So that very particular boomer experience of the delineation between their generation and the war generation of their parents is now kind of being artificially extended to describe every relationship between kids and their parents for all time, right? That we all kind of have to... Gen Xers, millennials, Zoomers, that we all kind of have to interact with other generations the way that the boomers interacted with their parents.
And there's not that whole lot of difference anymore. It's just getting to be where the parents don't look or sound a lot different than their kids, really.
And I think it creates like some kind of like weird insecurities as well, because sometimes I kind of feel like, oh, am I acting too young? Am I too interested in young people things? Like, am I supposed to be more different from the Zoomers and more different from the Boomers and this kind of thing? It's not. I think it can be pretty destructive. I mean, it's. People should be perhaps a little bit less self-conscious about... I think categorization in general can be a problematic thing.
We love to categorize everything.
Everything has to put into a bucket. Like, as soon as something fits in a bucket, then it makes more sense and I can move on from it.
And then you work backwards from it, right? It's very much like, Canadians and Americans, right? It's like the second you sort of put yourself into one of these columns, then you start to like, you have to rationalize the existence of that column. And then so you go through life living in this kind of like hypersensitive way with your antenna up, looking for any little subtle difference that you can then glom onto and say, aha, I am such a typical, Canadian or boomer or, ENTP if you're into that sort of thing, or Cancer or, Capricorn or, this kind of stuff, right? It's all, I don't know. I mean, there's some use to it. I mean, I think it's useful to have orientation points to understand your identity, but, people, and particularly on YouTube, people go far too far, I think, pandering to some of this kind of stuff.
This is the most Canadian question I have.
Okay.
I saved it deliberately till last.
Oh my.
I've been a Canadian all my life. I've lived in Ontario all of my life, and all of my
I don't
family
like where this is going. I know what you're going to ask me. You're gonna say, why do I have such a weird accent, right?
No, well, it's not even just your accent, because I'm completely used to your accent. It's literally just that you are the only Canadian I know that says aboot.
But I'm not, though. Like, most Canadians do.
Sorry. Yes, most
Canadian. This is interesting.
Is it an Ontario, British Columbia thing? Because that's.
I'm going to stand back.
I think it is. Obviously it varies from region to region, and there are tremendous regional accent variations, and I'm a product of the sort of people that raised me in the kind of milieu I grew up in. But at the same time, like, I think that a lot of Canadians are in tremendous denial about the degree that they do have distinctive accents, and that their distinctive accent is often recognizable by the way that we pronounce certain words with oohs. And actually, I can give you a good example of this. I was just yesterday, I was listening to your podcast interview with the young man who does the documentaries with the abandoned buildings. I can't remember what his name.
Jake.
Yeah. And so, like, I'd never heard of this guy before, but as I was listening to him as I was walking around, it's like, oh, he says, like, aboot and house and around and, like, these kind of words and this kind of ooey sort of sound. It's like, oh, he must be a Canadian. And true enough, he was a Canadian, right? And the fact that I get so much sort of bullying and teasing for the way that sort of I have this kind of, like, you know, strong way of pronouncing those kind of sounds, it's just kind of made me, I think, a lot more sensitive to the fact that this is actually a very mainstream thing. But because, and I suppose this is in some ways like a sort of great Canadian hypocrisy, is that on the one hand, like, Canadians want to be so different than Americans and, like, nothing the same, we're so different, but then when you point out a difference like this, like that we have slightly different speech patterns or slightly different accents, we do not, we talk exactly the same as Americans, you can't tell us apart whatsoever. But I find that, like, a lot of Canadians sort of say, like, oh, your accent is weird or fake, or I've never heard anybody talk like that before, and then the Americans are all just kind of like, yeah, that tracks, you know, that's how Canadians talk, it doesn't seem remarkable to me at all.
It's because we all think of South Park.
Well, I mean, but Americans are very good at understanding accents, I think, in a way that Canadians are not, because Americans are, I mean, America has a great deal of accents, but Americans, I think, are just also more sensitive and more sort of self-aware and even more celebratory. Like, people can, it often shocks me, like, an American can be like, oh, you're from Ohio, right? Not to me, but, you know, they're talking to somebody, and they're like, oh yeah, I can kind of detect sort of like you have an Ohio accent, or you have like a Pittsburgh accent, and, you know, you have a Chicago accent, and, you know, obviously, or even like within the South, like, there's all these funny videos on YouTube about people like doing, like, here's how Alabama people talk versus how South Carolina people talk, and whereas I think that there's kind of this idea in Canada, and in part because things like South Park have made such a big joke about sort of Canadian accents, there's a lot of sort of insecurity about this kind of thing, and an idea, and I've heard Canadians sort of say this, it's like, you know, no, Canadians just like speak a very pure, clean English. Like, we have like no noticeable accent at all. We speak like newscasters. We're just so eloquent and so unremarkable in our tone.
That newscaster dialogue, there's actually, I think that might actually be the name for it or something, but it's a taught accent.
Yeah,
I guess.
it is.
All newscasters do that. And,
it's hilarious when you have people like, you know, who know, like, you know, somebody like me who's been in sort of like the journalism space, when you see like your friends working on television and they're doing this like delivery that is so affected and it sounds like every other newscaster, and and it's just like, that's not how you talk, but it's like, yeah, you train to enunciate in a very particular way, in part because that way it doesn't seem regional, and thus you can syndicate that kind of content to news stations all over the continent.
Yeah, and because the newscasters themselves would be moving around from station to station, they didn't want to bring their own accent to wherever they might be and potentially mess with the people, the locals there. Yeah,
absolutely.
But I think that it's good that we celebrate these differences in accents because, and you mentioned in your video about accents, the Canadian accents, is that we are losing a lot of this, and a lot of it is just becoming this general, like, North American accent, I guess.
Yeah, there is some insecurity about that, and it's kind of funny. Like, people in Newfoundland, for instance, you know, small province in eastern Canada, they at one time had very strong accents, almost sort of like Irish kind of sounding. And I remember once watching a broadcast on the CBC where they were sort of interviewing some Newfoundland elders, and they were saying, oh, you know, it's too bad, like the kids today, they don't have the good accents anymore. And you see this a lot in England as well, like in Great Britain, they have tremendous accent divergence, you know, just from Liverpool to Nottingham or whatever, these crazy places. And like, British people sometimes get defensive about that, like that the decline of accents is seen as a loss of their culture in some sort of substantial way, because I suppose it does sort of suggest that we're living in a kind of more globalized world where people just kind of come and go, and people consume media like YouTube, which is very international, very sort of broadly accessible, and the sort of variables that you're exposed to in your life that perhaps left me talking the way I do and left you guys talking the way that you do are sort of somewhat less present, and people are being socialized in a different way, and that sort of results in a different type of person.
Well, we're going to have you come back on to talk more in depth about so many different topics. I love a guest like you that has such a diverse range of topics that we can really explore. We didn't even get into the 13 fakey countries that are in the Olympics right now.
Well, I'd love to come back. This was fantastic.
Let
me just say, like, I'm a really legitimate big fan of your show. I think you guys are doing a real useful service, and I think that hearing all of these different YouTubers tell their stories has been fascinating, and it's made me learn a lot. And so, yeah, full endorsement to this. Anyone who's listening to this just because they wanted to hear me talk should go back to the catalog and listen to a bunch of old episodes, because it's
I
really
really
fascinating
appreciate
stuff.
that. That's one of the hardest things for us is just discovery, just to get people to really understand what the show is about. You know, when we started, we didn't know what it was about, and then eventually we found our footing with it. But it's hard because a lot of times people will find that one guest that they know and they want to listen to that interview, and then it's trying to sell them, well, you might also be interested in hearing about people that you don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and it says something about your skills as an interviewer, that you're sort of able to make stories that you wouldn't think would be as interesting to an outsider. So.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you being on our show. If anybody listening to this would like to check out JJ's channel, I hope you do. It's JJ McCullough. I won't spell that out for you. You can look, because we will have a link down in the description. I mean, it's not an unusual spelling of McCullough, right? It's the normal spelling of McCullough, but I think a lot of people might stumble over it a little bit.
I'm thinking of just going to JJ because it's much easier.
Probably, yeah. Just go to JJ, like the flag guy or something like that, and I'll bet you YouTube will find his channel.
I often tell people just do JJ Canada, because then
that'll
there
you
work.
go. Yeah, Canada. That'll work. And thank you for listening to this episode of Chad and Steve Have a Podcast. You could really help us out by sharing this with somebody you know, maybe on your social media. We'd like to get the word out a little bit more. We're coming up on our 50th episode really soon, Chad.
Wow.
We're going to have a very special episode. We've already planned it.
Mm-hmm. No guest, just me and you, reflecting on 50 episodes of awesomeness.
Going back to the old days, yeah.
Oh, boy.
Thanks for listening, everybody.